The General came for the weekend, and we were having dinner when he accused me of being addicted to my phone. "Your brain is being hacked," he declared. "Can you even go to the toilet without it?" I had to admit that I often sit on the throne in the bathroom with the phone in one hand, and I always leave it on the windowsill when I'm soaking in a hot bath. So I decided to give it up for a day, and since the following morning was Sunday, I thought it might be an appropriate day of rest. When I woke, I left the phone on the bedside locker, but struggled to get through breakfast in the silence. Later, I sat on a bench in the garden to relax, where the only sound was the chirp of a cricket in the gorse. He sounded like he was using a loudhailer to pump out the dry clickety-click sound of his virility. And I have read that you can measure a cricket's copullarity by the volume of his chirps, so this fellow must have been driving females daft. Personally speaking, there's only so much chirping I can endure from a noisy cricket when I have no phone to play with. The sound was coming from a neighbour's field, full of wild fern and gorse, so I decided to venture in with the handle of an old broom in my fist, intending to banish the insect from the vicinity. I knew the ferns and gorse were full of ticks, but it was the cricket that bothered me. Every few seconds he would fall silent, so that I was forced to move around the gorse, chasing after him, and stumbling like Cucullin, flailing about in the sea. The insect was toying with me by falling silent and then starting up again 10 metres away. And to make matters worse, I could feel something crawling up my leg and digging into my backside. I fled for the safety of my own lawn to check, and sure enough, a plump little tick was beavering away inside my boxer shorts with his arse and hind legs hanging out. Whether the abundance of ticks is a result of deer or the overgrowth of ferns and gorse, I know not, but I knew the black thing on my leg carried the risk of Lyme disease, and Lyme disease can be a catastrophe. I ran screaming, "Ticks!" and by the time I got to the patio, the General was approaching with the tweezers. "Where is it?" he demanded to know. I told him that I was inclined to use a cigarette lighter. "You don't smoke," he replied. "We could use a match," I suggested. "Trust me," he said, "I'm trained to kill. The notion that a tick will fall out if you heat its bum is not true." So I agreed to the intimacy of a small surgery at the General's professional hands. He did proceed with the best practice as advised by health professionals. The tweezers to grasp the little black devil as close to the skin as possible, slowly pulling upwards, taking care not to crush the tick, and cleaning the bite with antiseptic soap. Thus concluded the operation. The general was hugely successful, although he did observe that I appeared to be in distress. He suggested paracetamol. Why would I need paracetamol? I wondered. Because you said you had a headache at breakfast. That was a lie, I declared. I decided to admit everything. I just need my phone back, I confessed. So I went to the bedroom, retrieved the pure white phone, turned it on, and attached my brain. Within seconds, I was surfing for news from various war fronts in the Middle East, Ukraine and Sudan, and scrolling down Twitter for all the latest portentous remarks from righteous politicians, entertainers, and my favourite journalists. My brain had reconnected with the necessary flow of meaningless information. I was back in the game as I sat on the bench and the general strutted around the garden, sniffing the Albertine roses. He appeared reasonably content, just to stare at clouds in the sky. His ears quivered at some sound, and then he spoke. "I think I can hear a little cricket in the distance," he said. "Isn't it just delightful?" Now, you may not think that's true, but it is. Every word of it. And there is a huge amount of gorse and ferns that grow in a field just close to our land, if you like. And they do have a lot of ticks. And there's also deer that come occasionally. I've seen them once or twice in winter or in autumn, galloping up the road so fast that, if there was a car coming down at the same moment, there'd be a terrible crash. You'd have a big deer banging off your windscreen. There was one time, I may have mentioned it before, it was an amazing event, even though I wasn't there to witness it. But there was one morning my wife and child were in the backyard. And all of a sudden in the field next door, in fact in the field where the cricket was, exactly the same space, it's a field closest to the kitchen door, and I've written about it in a book called Staring at Lakes. I described how my daughter used to sit under the gorse with two donkeys. Those two donkeys, and they lived in a shed at the bottom of the hill. They were owned by Germans, and the German couple would let them out in the morning, and the two donkeys would come up the hill. The male donkey had come first, and when he got to the top of the hill, he'd let a big bellows roar out of him. And that was the signal that everything was safe and well, and then the female donkey, and there was a baby donkey at one stage, and then they'd come up, and the three of them would spend the whole day in the field, moving around in the gorse and the rushes, and if it was very warm or hot, they would sit down underneath the gorse. The gorse would be growing nearly like trees, and there'd be shelter, and in there you'd have three donkeys, and our little daughter used to go in there and sit with the donkeys. Now, I wrote that story in Staring at Lakes, but there was one day I wasn't about, I was away. A deer appeared, and not just a deer, but a stag, a mighty stag with antlers and that proud arching look that you'll get from a stag. Well, the two ladies were absolutely leaping out of their skin with excitement, and they thought it was beautiful, and they turned away just for a second to kind of acknowledge each other. Are we actually looking? Are we seeing what we're seeing? And it was only a split second maybe that their two heads were turned away, and when they turned back, the stag had disappeared, was no longer there, was vanished. How a stag can do that, I don't know, but there's something enormously beautiful about it. And I always talk about St. Patrick when I talk about stags, because St. Patrick is associated with the deer and with the stag, and it was said that he too could disappear. Like if he was going up north, up the country, and let's say he was in enemy territory, well, he could disappear and turn himself into a stag. And he would use the form of the stag to move around without people knowing he was there. He'd escape his enemies. It's an interesting story because there's a real potency of image and metaphor in it. The stag is the one who in real time can really disappear simply by the swiftness of his body and the way that he might be watching you. And the minute he gets a chance, the minute you take your eye off him, he's gone and you will not see him. So that potency of a natural animal within nature to become invisible, I think is the suitable sort of cloak under which they put St. Patrick, the storyteller puts St. Patrick in that context, if you like, in a kind of a natural context, by saying that St. Patrick could vanish and become a deer, and then a deer could vanish. But the vanishing of the deer was something real that could happen. So therefore, if the deer could vanish, and that was real, it was plausible for the storyteller to say, well, St. Patrick would become a deer to avoid his enemies. And why I like it, I get enthusiastic about this, and I won't go on too long about it because I want to get back to the stories. But I love that deer and the idea of Patrick as being this presence that can kind of disappear and reappear. And I see it tied into one of my favourite prayers, as you know, Christ before me, Christ behind me. Because in that prayer, St. Patrick's breastplate, when people say Christ before me, or Christ behind me, or Christ beside me, it's not that they're saying Christ is some sort of ghost, floating around beside me, or behind me, or above me, or below me. No, it's actually a very deep theological idea. And that is that in the complete resurrection of Jesus becoming the Christ and being risen from the dead, in the new church, in the gathering of people under the power of God's Spirit, there is a new awakening to the intimacy of God's presence, and it's common through Christ. But Christ is now himself a transformed, transfigured, in glory. And so it's like, and this is the kind of St. Paul stuff that you'll find reading St. Paul's letters, but it's like Christ in glory has become a kind of cosmic presence. Is everywhere, not fully and completely in the bread and the wine and the Eucharist, but everywhere. Because everything is transformed in the moment of Christ's resurrection. It's like an ontological change has happened in evolution. We are now looking and experiencing the cosmos at a different level, at a much more intimate level, that it's like the fingerprint of God. It is the revelation of God. Remember when you said that Yeshua, I'm using that word Yeshua now, I know it's fashionable, and sometimes, we resist things that are fashionable, but to be honest, I think it's a nice way. The word Jesus, it's locked in a kind of an understanding that's very Western, very Anglo, very English languagey. But Yeshua, which may be closer to how the name was pronounced. So anyway, this idea that Yeshua is transformed and is in the glory. Everything is changed in that resurrection. The resurrection it's not plausible in terms of science, in terms of rationalism. It's not plausible. And a lot of people, they shy away from believing it. They shy away from proclaiming it because it seems it's a step too far. I should say, because I'm guilty of this myself, but we go along sometimes with rational modernity. And we kind of go as far as we can to say that we believe in Christ and that we feel associated with him in the Eucharist and all sorts of things. But we shy away from the fundamental, clear idea that the universe is transformed because all the laws of logic and reason and science are broken in the moment of the resurrection. I suppose it'd be the difference like between your cultural Christian and Christian. And I'm really happy that Richard Dawkins talks now about being a cultural Christian. I think there is, like, I wouldn't be dismissing people like Dawkins who see themselves as culturally Christian. To me, they are also within the fold. They are within the... I think there was guys like that in monasteries, always. Great intellectuals who led the way by negating the ideas that we have now about God. They opened the door to new ideas and new insights into the nature of the Godhead. But I also feel that there is a fundamental need for me, certainly, as a Christian, to proclaim the full resurrection. And thereby the full glory and ascension of Mary the Mother into heaven. So that I hold something that I'm holding with my heart, not my mind rationally, but with my heart. I choose to hold on to this, what is a ridiculous idea in the eyes of the world. Ridiculous to a scientist. Ridiculous. How could an intelligent person like me believe that? And yet, I believe that by holding to that in its pristine beauty and simplicity, the full, complete resurrection of one human being. And in him is the deepest, complete, full revelation of the Godhead. Well, it's an amazing kind of idea, even if you don't believe it. And if you try it out for a little bit, I'll give you an idea. Sometimes in religion, you do have to leap. And sometimes you have to leap away from your own reason. You know, it happens in love. This happens in love all the time. You'll get somebody, a young couple, and they're in, they just love each other. And they're all the time together. But let's say they're poor. Let's say they're living in Ireland 100 years ago. I'm just making this up. Let's say they're struggling and she's maybe in domestic service and he's maybe, working on a farm or something, and they meet on a Sunday and they just love each other and they think about each other every day and every night. And they so want to be together. And then let's say that she says, she's reading the paper and she sees an ad for, a boat going to New York. And she has this dream, maybe because of her relations, that if they were in New York, they could make a great life together. And so she says it to him the next Sunday that they meet. And she says, I had an aunt who went out there and she had a wonderful life and she's a lovely home and this, that and the other. And we could do that. And he's thinking, no, I'm not doing that. I have a good job now on the farm. And my family would kill me if my father thought I was leaving Ireland. And he's reasons, he's rational explanations to say this ain't going to happen. And she's looking into his eyes. And he knows she loves him. And he says, okay, let's do it. He's taken a leap that rationally he doesn't believe in. But like 100 million human beings before him, he knows instinctively that if you act on faith, you can transform the universe. You can fully transform your life if you act on faith, even if you're not there rationally with the faith. If you're just being reasonable, the two lovers, him and her, if they had been reasonable, he might have said, well, okay, let's go to America, but not this year. We'll save enough money so that we have a little bit of security or a nest egg. And many people would do that. They would rationalize how to do something without taking a risk. And mostly that's the right way to live. Don't take risks. But there's also a moment in life where you do take a risk. Very often it's like for love. Very often it's like when a couple meet and they change their lives because they take a mad, wonderful risk because they're in love. And it seems the right thing to do to kind of, believe that you will live on air when you get to America or wherever. It's an act of faith. And I also think that the same is true about the Christian faith at the moment. I think it's okay, that people are getting, they're getting fierce, worried and annoyed about migrants and immigrants and refugees and, Europe is going to be overrun by Muslims and stuff. I tell you, I wouldn't be bothered about that at all. To be honest with you, like I'm only speaking personally now. I mean, like those loads of places that once were Christian and now they're Muslim. That's not a bad thing. I know that's contentious to say, but I just have to say, as somebody of faith, you can't judge how things will work out in the future. There could be great journeys. And certainly for a Christian, and I've heard bishops say this, that for a Christian, when the institution of the church declines, as it has done in Ireland over the past 40 years, as it has done in Europe over the past 2 centuries, when that happens, it's not necessarily a bad thing for Christians, because it's like a purification. It's like it purifies you if things go in that direction. And then you find you belong to a church that is smaller, more simple, and clearer about the message of being a Christian. There's a good parallel to it again in Tibetan Buddhism, because Tibetan Buddhism, my goodness, the Chinese came in and have transformed that country. And you could say a lot of really, really terrible things happened to the Tibetan people, and they lost their land, their sovereignty, their autonomy, and their religion. And I always find it very moving how the many, many monks and lamas who came to the West, they all speak with peace in their hearts about China. I remember being at a prayer hall in India one day, and the Dalai Lama had been there about 4 days earlier, and there was a big beehive, like a big drip of honey hanging from the veranda. And this monk told me that when the Dalai Lama was there, they asked him, "What'll we do with the bees? Should we remove them? Because they are a stinging bee." And the Dalai Lama said, no, he says, "Leave them where they are." He says, "They're like the Chinese, they're unwelcome guests, and they'll go in their own time." Now that's a very, very powerful example of non-violence in relation to Tibet and China. But a lot of lamas in the Tibetan tradition recognize that maybe the way that Lamaism had developed in Tibet and was in a powerful position and was abusing its power over poor peasants, that in some sense the influx of the Chinese power, might and violence was inevitable. He's not saying we brought it on ourselves, but he's saying, like, sometimes a terrible thing is happening to you, but if you see it in terms of faith, it may improve you. And the Christian church was in decline in the West for 200 years. We got very secular, we got very neutral about it, so there's not a lot of reason for complaining, but if people turn their hearts to a different way of prayerfulness, a different way of being in the world, oh yeah, that'll have its problems too, there's no doubt about that, and you know yourself, that would have many huge problems in human terms. But all I'm saying is that from a Christian point of view, if Christians ended up that they were no longer in control, let's say, in Ireland, and weren't running education in Ireland, and weren't just, everywhere in society in Ireland as it used to be 40 years ago, if that comes to be the case, it's not a bad thing. It becomes a time of purification for the church. It's okay. So in relation to faith, it's taken that risk that is beyond what is reasonable, beyond what's rational. And I personally hold to that, even though I don't sort of judge somebody else who doesn't believe as strongly as I do in the resurrection. But I do love to share with people how, as a modern, rational, reasonable person, I can actually hold in my heart, I can hold to the idea of the complete, full, bodily resurrection of Jesus, Yeshua, and the assumption of his mother into heaven. And in some way, the fact that it's beyond reason gives it its strength within the rational world. It's like having a rope that holds me up, and the other end of the rope is not like just to the roof of the house, it goes to heaven. It's like there's something breaking through the ordinariness of the whole world when I say that I believe in Christ. I'm being utterly subversive to logic. I'm being subversive to science. And that's the core, I think, power of religion. And there's nowhere that it's more clear than when somebody is coming to the end of their life and they smile and they think, I am going to be with Christ. And there is some part of the human psyche where that's true, where we know it's true, and where we get great peace from it. If we're suffering, if we're aging, if we're getting old, if we're lonely, then it is the faith in Christ as a presence that defies all rational logic, even the reasonableness of getting old and dying, that Christ is with you and will be with you. And that's just the way that religions work. It's the way that faith works. So that would be everything to me. And I suppose I didn't mean to go there, but you know me, I can't stop myself. I was going to read another little piece. And before I read it, share it with you, I'm going to let the clock call out. This is going to be on the hour because it's 4 o'clock on Friday, the 9th of August. This is a big long one. And there it goes. 1, 2, 3. I love that. Anyway, I was going to read this other little piece or share it with you. And the reason I'll tell you why. I'm finished my new book, and I have the final copy, the proof, what they call the proof, and that arrived yesterday, and I'm reading through it just in case there's some little comma or some little word that's wrong or somebody's name is wrong or whatever. So I'm just checking the proofs, that's what they say. And it'll be in the bookshops in October. And if you've ever come to any of my shows, I'll be touring again starting in January. And very soon now, your local arts centre or theatre will have details of when I'm there. So it's a milestone for me to have completed what is the 9th book in a series, 9 volumes, chronicling ordinary life. And I thought that because the first one, Staring at Lakes, is like a midlife crisis book. It's like how a man breaks down. And then the second one, Hanging with the Elephant, is all about grief. I wrote it just after my mother died. And it was strange because she was 96 when she died, and I was ill myself at the time, and I felt a terrible sense of loss. Even though, you would think at 96 you knew she was going to die, like she had a good innings, as they'd say. But it's amazing how when somebody dies, there's still an enormous emptiness inside you. And there's nothing can fill it. That's one of the real pains, I think, of loss, bereavement, is that there is no compensation for that absence. The only thing is that everybody says, people who have really suffered, they always say that the only consolation is that you come to live with it. You come to live with the absence. And that it becomes a new life. Sometimes enriching. Because somebody, can die. And you feel strangely enriched. When you think you'd feel sorrowful, you feel like enriched because in some way their whole life is now finished and it now kind of appears to you as what it was for you. And you realize, well, I feel enriched by that person, parent or whatever. And that's why I called my new book, I Loved Him from the Day He Died. Because it's about my father. And I felt from the day he died, I felt enriched. I felt like he died when I was about 22. And it was like I was too young to understand him or to know him or to ask him any questions. So there was a gap between us that was never closed. But yet from the moment he died, I felt his life has been a gift to me. And I felt grateful and I felt I loved him. And it's funny because the second volume of the memoir was Hanging with the Elephant, which was grief about the mother. I went on then and I wrote kind of thing about trying to find identity. It was called Talking to Strangers. And I wrote about the limitations that I experienced in psychotherapy, the value of psychotherapy, but also the limitation and the value of faith. It was a book called On Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. And I went on to write Chest Pain, which is, again, it's not just a meditation on having a heart attack, it's a meditation on actually trying to find Christ in a real way and struggling with that in the church. And then after that, we were in lockdown because of COVID, and I wrote a book called Something Beautiful in the Sky. And then came letters that I wrote to people who had died, and I hadn't really said things. So many people pass away, and I feel I never really told them how much they mattered to me. I never really told them how much I loved them. And so I wrote a book of letters to people that I had loved and that had died unexpectedly, saying to them things that that I forgot to say or failed to say when they were alive. It's a pity to be at somebody's graveside and feeling remorse that you didn't tell them how much you loved them. So that was that book, and then I thought I've another book to write here, because the one thing that I hadn't done in that whole series of books was to do a meditation on my father. And that's the new book. And I'll also be reading it on audiobooks, which will come out in October at the same time. So, because it's about my father, I thought I'd end today by reflecting on that strange and lovely man. I have a hat someone bought 10 years ago for me. It's a black fedora. They purchased it for Father's Day. And when I first put it on, I felt ridiculous. My head was big enough even without a hat, but the fedora sat like a crude affectation, and I looked like a cross between me father and Humphrey Bogart. Not exactly the look I would want at the Drumshambo Horse Mart. So it ended up on top of a wardrobe. Every so often I gave it an outing, but eventually it vanished into the boot of the car and was forgotten. Recently I was in Cavan to pay a visit to my parents' grave, and as I arrived at the cemetery, it began to rain. It being June, I had no raincoat with me, but the fedora did the job. It's not easy to find anything in a graveyard. There are too many dead people underneath monuments that all look the same. And I'd hate to be seen searching for a grave, in case people might think I wasn't a regular visitor. I remember walking into a cemetery in Florida in the early 1980s with a lady who had buried her husband the previous year. They had not enjoyed their marriage much, and apparently bickered like cantankerous hens for 40 years. She told me this in the back of a taxi as we headed for the cemetery. After trying a few aisles without success, she hissed at her dead husband under her breath. "George," she whined, "you're always doing this to me. Where the hell are you?" I eventually found my parents' plot, but it was still raining and the grave looked different. There were 3 little porcelain angels at the base of the headstone, none of which I had seen before. And I guessed that they didn't appear by divine intervention. Someone may have been tidying up their own family plot and wanted to dispose of some ornaments. Rather than walk to a bin at the far end of the cemetery or just take them away, they decided to leave the ornaments on another grave. It was an endearing gesture. I liked it, not because of any theological significance that might be attached to porcelain angels, but someone had expressed a prayer for my parents when they placed those little gaudy figures on the grave. Yet I would never know who it was. That's the beauty of life. The present is impermanent, no more than a brief moment in the long continuum of passing time. It's a feeling I often get in historic locations, in Kilmainham jail or in the GPO or where some great politician lived. In fact, I felt it one time in the back of a car when I realised that Henry Kissinger had rested his arse on the very same seat that I was sitting on. There was a television programme at the time in the 90s called Questions and Answers on RTE, and for some reason I was invited to be on the panel. Initially, I said I couldn't accept because I was on stage in Carlow that evening with a one-man show about Jonathan Swift. But the producers asked me what time the show finished, and I said 9 p.m, and they said they could get me to the studio for 10:15 in a fast car. Those were the days when RTE programmes could hire the most elite executive limos to transport guests to and from studios. So I agreed, and after the show, an enormous Mercedes was pouring outside the theatre. I swaggered through the foyer, hoping that the punters realised it was me getting into the car. And later, as we neared Donnybrook, I couldn't resist declaring to the driver, "You can't beat the old Merc." The executive chauffeur, with understated pride, agreed and revealed that his last commission the previous day had in fact been Henry Kissinger. I was overwhelmed with awe, fingering the soft leather seat and thinking how me and Dr. Kissinger had gazed at the world through the window of the same car. And standing at my father's grave, I had a similar thought, that only time separated me from whatever stranger had placed the angels on the grave. The rain was lashing, falling on the angels and the clay, and spilling from the rim of my fedora. And I knew how much I resembled my father as I had aged, and how the only thing that separates me from him, or indeed anyone else in that graveyard, is that I still have a little more time. And I love graveyards for that reason. I mean, my parents are in Killigarry graveyard in Cavan, and when I go there for blessing the graves, it's like I know an awful lot of people underground, but I also know a lot of people overground, because the whole town gathers on that day. And it's about the town feeling a community, feeling together. You know, it's a remarkable moment everywhere in Ireland, the blessing of the graves. It's like the whole community is there, and they stand together with a great sense of camaraderie and sameness, and that we're all at the same level. And the reason it happens is because of the people who are underground. You're walking on hundreds of coffins with the dead sleeping in the earth. People that you knew. So I'm standing there at my grave and I'm looking up, and there's a fella my own age, and we're remembering when we were kids, and I'm remembering his mammy, and he's remembering my mammy. That's, you know, enough said. The collective sense that we are all mortal, and that the only thing that distinguishes us from those who have gone before us is that we have a little more time. We have this day. And I felt it, I do feel it actually, to be honest with you, more as I get older. I feel that sense of an uneasy affinity with my father. The more my hair goes grey, the more like I need glasses now. Everything about me, when I look in the mirror, is him. And even my voice is him. And it's like, I don't want to be my father. You know, he's dead. I want to be young when I think of my father, but now I become my father. I've moved up in the queue. I'm now at the end of the queue. And young people come after us. And that's the way it is. And the more I get to that position through aging with my own father, the more I enjoy going to the graveyard for Grave Sunday and feeling that there's something powerful that binds us together as human beings in that graveyard. I could name you lovely people who have passed away, and there they sleep, and there their names are on those stones. You're walking down one aisle after another, and you said, there's Noel McGinty, and my goodness, and there's Katrina, and there's Seamus Fay. Like Seamus Fay, the beautiful lilter, the Cavan lilter, friend of my mother. I had the privilege of talking to him a few times. Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful man. Part of what you'd call old Cavan, where my mother really came from, was the culture of Seamus Fay. And the last time I was there, in the graveyard, and I'm walking down the aisle towards me father and mother's grave, and there, the corner of my eye, I catch the name, just recently etched on the stone, Seamus Fay. And you have those moments in graveyards. And they're very, very beneficial because they allow us to think how equal we all are, you know, and how the only thing that distinguishes us, makes us different from the ones who are sleeping there in front of us and below our feet. The only thing that is different is we have a little more time. And if that makes you anxious or sad, all I can share with you is that the thing that gives me consolation and joy is that idea of the risen Christ. The risen Christ as a cosmic reality into which we are all drawn. Like it's a magnet, it draws us in. And the cosmic Christ is the eternal sense of love, the condition of compassion at the heart of every molecule and atom in the universe. And it draws us in to be there and to let go of the mortal flesh, the coil of humanity that we're bound up in for 70 years or 80 for those who are strong, to let go of it and be released into the resurrection of Christ, into the condition of eternal love. And to go back to the deer and the early Christians in Ireland and St. Patrick, they had it right. When they did the high crosses, and you see them all over the country, but the one consistent thing you'll find with high crosses is that they face west. And on the western face of the High Cross, you will find the crucifixion, and you'll find stories from the Old Testament like Adam and Eve and Moses and things that remind us and link the Old Testament with the crucifixion. And that's always on the western side of the cross. But if you go to the other side, the eastern side of the cross, you will always find the resurrection, the risen Christ. So it's like when you walk around the cross, you're experiencing two different dimensions of reality. One is the surface reality, the reality of mortal flesh, the reality of death, the reality of crucifixion. As it can be, as life can be for any of us, that sense of crucifixion. You experience that as you walk around the western side of the cross, but then as you come to the other side, the eastern side, the side that's closest to the sun, like the sun comes up in the east and it shines, that's the side it shines on. That's the side it shines on. And if you could imagine the cross like a kind of a lens, then that light of the sun coming up on the mountain, it's hitting the eastern side of the cross and it's coming through. Imagine it coming through. So we see on the surface suffering. We see on the surface Christ on the cross. But if we could penetrate, if we could look deeply into reality, and symbolically, if we could just walk around to the other side of the cross, we would see the resurrection, the risen Christ. And those old crosses are such a powerful reminder, after 1,500 years, they're still there, speaking to us of the resurrection. So I hope you're okay. I hope you're full of joy and that you have a lovely weekend and that you have a faith in your heart that's a consolation to you in times of trouble. And thank you for being here.